In this second segment on the politics of Congress, we're going to clean up some of the election issues that we didn't get to yet. We'll be talking about gerrymandering, midterm elections, presidential coattails, that sort of thing. And then we'll move on to the last section, which will be Congress's functions. And we'll see that those functions are to represent we the people, to legislate for the nation, and to perform oversight, checks and balances vis-a-vis, in particular, the executive branch. All right, so let's talk here briefly about an important issue. It gets a little complex. And again, I don't want to make this into a little mini law school class. So I'm going to try to avoid getting too deep into the weeds here. But gerrymandering. That is how typically state legislatures draw electoral boundaries every 10 years after a census. So there'll be one coming up, right? After this next election cycle in November, we're going to have gerrymandering, or not gerrymandering necessarily. We're going to have electoral line drawing in 2020, probably early 2021, here in Nevada and elsewhere, right? All 50 states. It has to be done, right? Because populations shift. It's got to be one person, one vote, both for state legislatures and for the House of Representatives. So, clear enough. But then how you draw those lines gets super complicated super quickly, because it turns out there's a lot at stake in terms of politics. That how you draw them can make a big difference in which party wins and which party loses. And if you win, how much do you win by, and so on. So there's a lot at stake with the line drawing. So let's talk first about partisan gerrymandering. That is the most common form, and that is when a state legislature typically will draw lines. And, you know, if the Democratic Party controls the legislature, and let's say they also control the governorship, right, they're going to have a free hand, as it were, to draw the lines that they prefer. So they have two basic strategies there. One's called packing and one's called cracking. Either one can work. Packing would be where you try to take, let's say for the Democrats, you try to take most Republicans and just try to fit them into a few districts, right? Where Republicans will dominate those few districts. They'll win by 40 or 50 points on election day. Right? But because you've packed so many into a few districts, that means all the other districts are going to have more Democrats. Not by as much. You know, Democrats won't win by as much. But remember what the rule is, right, in American politics. If you win by one vote, you get all the representation for a district, right? So that's packing, right? You pack as many members of the other party into as few districts as possible. You essentially give them those districts to win by wide margins on election day so that you can win a much larger number of districts by a much smaller margin. It's very cynical, and it can be very effective. And then there's cracking. That'd be the flip side of packing. That's where you try to, you know, sort of spread out the other party into as many districts as possible so that they're a minority in almost all districts. It's the flip side of packing. So those are two basic methodologies that are used to benefit one party over the other, partisan gerrymandering. For a long time, the court said, we'll mostly not interfere with those things, although they bother us. But if they're bad enough, if the gap between overall statewide vote and representation in the legislature is too great over too many cycles, at some point we might find an equal protection violation under the 14th Amendment. But very recently, just last term, the Supreme Court decided to abandon that interference and said, nah, we're going to leave it up to the states to do as they see fit. So partisan gerrymandering is now anything goes, at least in terms of the Supreme Court and the 14th Amendment. Yeah, so there's that. For a long time, the court kind of said we might step in extreme cases. Now they said, no, we'll never step in. And that was 5-4 a vote. Very controversial. It's one of those 50-50 issues. Racial and ethnic gerrymandering are seen as sketchier. The court's more willing to impose limits there. We know that, right, from our discussion about civil rights in the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. If a legislature takes race and ethnicity into too much account, that could violate equal protection. And And they would have to justify that with a compelling interest that the court will be very skeptical of. So in general, the court said be super careful about racial and ethnic gerrymandering. Now it's weird though, right? Because the 14th Amendment then, by that interpretation, says that you've got to limit racial and ethnic gerrymandering. You can hardly take it into account at all. Like with affirmative action, right? It can only be a small plus factor on the margins. You might want to take it into some account, but only to a very minor degree. The 14th Amendment. But then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and that gets super complicated, but bottom line, the way the court has interpreted that over time is that sometimes the Voting Rights Act might require that a legislature take race and ethnicity into some account to make sure that the voting power of minority groups are not diluted by the majority. All right, so maybe some of that they have to take special care to make sure that people of color get a fair shake in electoral line drawing, and for that you need to take it into account. All right, let me give you a quick example. Let's say that you've got a mythical state where the statewide population is, let's say, 30% non-white, 70% white. Right? One way the legislature could do that is they could say, we're not going to take it into any account, and that's going to result in, let's say, in every one of the congressional districts in that mythical state, all 10 of them, let's say, so you have 10 electoral districts, and all 10 of them, people of color will make up 30% of the voting population. Whites will make up 70%. We're neutral, right? And the courts have said, wait, that's bullshit, right? Because what you've really done is you've said minorities, although they make up 30% of the statewide population, in no one district can they determine who their representative is for the House of Reps. That's bullshit. You're diluting their voting power effectively. So what the court has said, sort of kinda, is that in probably 3 out of those 10 districts, you should try to make sure, as nearly as possible, without getting too weird with the line drawing, that people of color make up 50% or more of that district. Okay, so in order to accomplish that, right, you probably do need to take race into account to connect the dots in a way that creates minority-majority districts in 3 out of those 10, so that they have a chance, right, in 3 out of 10, 30%, to elect the candidate of their choice. Now, certain conditions have to obtain for that to happen, but that's the general idea behind the Voting Rights Act, right? Sometimes legislatures must take race into account. What can that mean sometimes, right? Legislatures get caught betwixt and between the two things. The 14th Amendment, right, says, as the court views it, you can barely take it into account, but the Voting Rights Act might require that you take it into account. Those conflict, right? There's some tension there. So sometimes legislatures get caught a little bit in between, and they're trying to figure out, right, how do we satisfy the mandate of both the 14th Amendment, be racially neutral, and the Voting Rights Act, maybe take race into account. It's tricky stuff, but that's something that's always out there in terms of how legislatures draw these lines. Now, it also turns out, right, that sometimes it's hard to do partisan gerrymandering without effectively doing racial gerrymandering. Because what do we know right now about how people vote and race and ethnicity? White people tend to vote Republican. People of color tend to vote Democratic. So if you're discriminating on the basis of partisanship, are you effectively discriminating on the basis of race? Maybe. Complicated. So these are some of the legal and political issues surrounding various forms of gerrymandering. And always you've got to have one person, one vote in terms of number of people in each district, as nearly as possible. And then finally, right, are there alternatives to partisan gerrymandering? There are, right? Arizona now has a relatively neutral bipartisan commission to draw those lines every 10 years. California does it that way. Utah now does it that way. So we're currently surrounded by states that have gone in that direction. Try to drain some of the partisan conflict out of gerrymandering. And Nevada has yet to do that. Turns out that Nevada League of Women Voters, maybe it's the League of Women Voters of Nevada, I forget which. One of my colleagues here at CSN, Dr. Sandra Cosgrove, is the head of that organization, and they've actually filed litigation against Nevada to get them to move to a more neutral bipartisan commission approach. So we'll see. It might happen here in Nevada as a result of that litigation. It might not. We'll see. All right, so that's a little primer there without getting even deeper into the weeds about the politics and the law of gerrymandering and electoral line drawing. Thanks. Okay, so what do we have here? Two ways of thinking about the ability of Congress to represent we the people, which again is its core function. First one, right, will be demographic representation. That's the idea that Congress should look something like, right, the people that they represent. So to what extent do we see the demographic profile of we the people reflected in the demographic profile of the U.S. Congress? Well, you know, it's a work in progress. So what you've seen, right, is over the years, 2015, right, somewhat diverse, 2017, more diverse, 2019, progress, 2021, even more progress, right? So we're moving in, and if you think demographic representation is important, and I think it is, we're moving in the right direction, right? So Congress as a whole, which includes, right, both the Senate and the House, about 23% people of color. Now nationally, what are we on that? Let me think for a minute. I think we're around somewhere in the mid-30s, right? So we're not there yet. We've got a ways to go if you think Congress should be as diverse as we the people. But again, moving in a good direction. Although note, that number is slightly inflated because it includes representatives in the House that are non-voting members from the territories and the District of Columbia. So places like Puerto Rico, Guam, the Northern Marianas Islands, the District of Columbia. So it includes those representatives. I think maybe all or nearly all are people of color, and yet they can't vote, right? So that's slightly overstated still. It's a lot of progress. And the Congress as a whole, gender diversity, 27%. You know, I've heard that the gender mix in America as a whole is about 50-50. So if that's the goal, and I don't know that it is, but it might be, but if that's the goal, right, you would say progress, but a ways to go perhaps. Although again, I think that includes in the House non-voting members from the territories and DC, and I think those are either all or disproportionately women. So again, slightly overstated. Also worth noting on both of those counts, both race and gender, the House is more representative of we the people, the Senate is less so. So you see pumped up numbers in the House on these measures, and then somewhat less impressive numbers, if you will, in the U.S. Senate. The Senate is less diverse, gender and race-wise, than the House of Reps, which should hardly be shocking, right? Because historically, the Senate has been about representing sort of more of the aristocracy, as it were, the powerful. And those are all statewide elections, right? And it can be harder for candidates of color, especially, to win statewide races, whereas they might be able to win, right, in a congressional district that's centered in an urban area. All right. Now others would say, hey, wait a minute, that's the wrong measure, or it's not the only measure of representation. Another way, right, to think about representation is policy or political representation. Does Congress, by and large, do what a majority of we the people want them to do? You would say about 2/3 of the time, yes. About 2/3 of the time, yes. So on that measure, you would say, you know, Congress does pretty well. They represent their constituents as a whole pretty effectively about 2/3 of the time. And some might say, right, well, maybe you don't want it to be 3/3 of the time. Maybe you don't want it to be 100%, because sometimes we the people want sketchy things, like Jim Crow, for example, in the South back in the day. Alternatively, right, you might say, well, the reason it's 2/3 is sometimes, right, members of Congress are responding to the desires of powerful interest groups, which may not be the same as the desires of we the people as a whole. All right, so those are two broad ways of thinking about the ability of Congress to represent we the people. There's the demographic angle, and there's the policy or political angle. Both of them, I think, are worth thinking about and considering as a way to measure the ability of Congress to represent we the people. Another key function of Congress, in addition to representation, is legislation. It is called a legislative body for a reason. Its primary job in many ways is to legislate on behalf of we the people as a way of representing them. If you ever go there, if you get a chance, go there. I would certainly suggest it. Go to the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., sit in on a session of the House or the Senate. And what you typically see is a lot of nothing going on. Sometimes members will rush onto the floor, cast a vote, and rush back out again. If you're looking for dramatic speeches and so forth on one side or the other of a bill, good luck with that. Typically, these things have been worked out ahead of time. The vote on the floor is just a mechanical sort of process. All of the stuff that's gone on before, typically in committee and subcommittee, which is where legislation often gets worked out, right? These are committees that specialize in certain areas, such as, let's say, the Judiciary Committee, the Agricultural Committee, the Space and Technology Committee. All of these various committees specialize in working on legislation in particular areas. That's where an awful lot of the work gets done. Members of the Democratic Party, the Republican Party on these committees, they're the ones hashing out the content of these bills, and then they're brought to the floor for a quick vote. So the vote itself is really not where the action is. That's more for show. The actual work, typically in committee and subcommittee, and of course in informal gatherings between various key members of Congress talking to one another about, let's do this, let's not do that, this will help the party, that won't help the party. Again, all of that's, the process is often not all that transparent. Again, if you're looking for the dramatic speeches on the floor and then a vote, very little of that goes on. I wish that it did, but it doesn't. Only in the movies, like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. We could also say this. The majority party in both houses, they're the ones who mostly control the legislative process. They dominate the legislative process. So what's the situation right now in Congress? Republicans have a majority in the House. They dominate and run that legislative process in the House. What about the Senate? Republicans control that chamber as well. They also control the legislative process, although in the Senate there's a difference, right? In the Senate they have a filibuster, which means that the minority party can threaten a filibuster, and typically it takes 60 votes to override that filibuster to invoke cloture. Although we know that Reid changed that rule recently and said that on presidential nominations to the courts, and I think maybe the executive branch as well, no longer can you filibuster, but you can on, I believe, ordinary legislation. So that gives the minority party more influence in the Senate, very little influence in the House, where they do not have the filibuster. Leadership is key in terms of who runs the legislative process. Speaker of the House, who represents the majority party in the House, House Majority Leader, House Minority Leader, House Majority Whip, House Minority Whip. Second in command, basically, are the whips. Some people below them as well. Each side has a leadership team. Harry Reid currently, right, Senate Minority Leader. Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader. In the House, John Boehner from Ohio was the representative Speaker of the House. And Nancy Pelosi is House Minority Leader. So the leadership plays a key role in shaping the legislative process. Rank and file mostly fall into line. Leadership mostly runs the show. And we should also say this, the legislative process as it's set up in America, many ways in which legislation can fail. Very difficult to push things through. Many points where things can be blocked and changed dramatically and vetoed by the president and so forth. So the legislative process is always extremely uphill. Getting things through is often a minor miracle, but things certainly do get through. All right, let's move on. All right, so now we finished up talking about the legislative functions of the U.S. Congress, and for more of detail on that, please check out the material in your book. They do a very nice job of exploring some of the nuances that we're not covering right here. Finally, then, that brings us to oversight. The third major function of Congress, the first is representation, the second is legislation, the third is oversight, mostly over the executive branch. Checks and balances, right? We've talked about that. How does Congress provide oversight of the executive branch? Public hearings like Iran-Contra from many years ago, right? When the Reagan administration was accused of engaging in some foreign policy hanky-panky that was not consistent with federal law. These charges were aired in public hearings as a way to send a message to the executive branch. We're watching you, we're paying attention, and if you misbehave, we're going to call you out on it. So a form of check and balance. Budgetary hearings. Every year, each executive branch agency, whether it's the Pentagon or the Department of Education or the IRS or the Department of Agriculture, all of these agencies get their money from Congress. And so every year Congress says, yo, agriculture, how have you been spending the people's money? What are you doing in terms of implementing the laws of the land? Are you spending that money wisely? Are you enforcing the laws in the ways that you think you should be enforcing these laws? So every year, every agency gets reviewed very carefully by Congress as to what they're doing with their budget and how they're enforcing the law of the land. That's a major check and balance on the executive branch. Impeachment, we've talked about that a little bit. It's a nuclear option, doesn't get used very often. It's never been successful going all the way through soup to nuts, albeit the Congress did formally charge Andrew Johnson with high crimes and misdemeanors. Johnson survived his Senate trial by 1 vote. Richard Nixon was on the verge of being impeached, and he resigned to avoid all of the messiness. He probably would have been both impeached and convicted at trial in the Senate by the 2/3 that you need in the Senate, majority on the charges in the House. And then Bill Clinton, of course, impeached by the U.S. House of Representatives. He easily survived his Senate trial on all of those charges. And in fact, actually became more popular as a result of that, because many saw that Newt Gingrich and others were perhaps overreaching with some of these charges. We're getting into Clinton's personal life in a way that was not entirely kosher. So in that one, Clinton came out ahead. That's unusual. Normally, it is an effective check and balance. Sends a message to the president to watch his or her P's and Q's. Finally, we would say Senate advice and consent on nominees to the federal courts and the bureaucracy. So what does the president need in order to get his or her people on the federal courts? Advice and consent from the Senate. And occasionally the Senate says no. Nominees to the federal bureaucracy. The leadership roles, about 2,000 or 3,000 of them. The president nominates people, but only with the advice and consent of the U.S. Senate. So again, right, very effective checks and balances. So let's not miss that part of what Congress does here. They do represent we the people. They do legislate for we the people, but they also provide oversight, checks and balances, predominantly over the executive branch.